violence, and nobody blowing a horn, which you could never get in Manhattan. Everybody just sitting quietly waiting for a police officer to wave them by, and a lot of people gathered around some of the supply trucks. Joey?
CNN's Richard Roth in Lower Manhattan at this hour.
Welcome back to our continuing coverage. I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington. Just want to report that when President Bush was visiting the site, the rubble today in Lower Manhattan, he met with the wife of a firefighter who has been confirmed to have died in this terrible tragedy. The wife presented President Bush with that firefighter's badge.
For the workers who work here, for the families who mourn.
Let's get an update right now on exactly what is happening at this moment. President Bush has toured Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. Early this evening, Mr. Bush rallied the rescue workers who are doing the arduous work of searching for survivors. The president said the whole nation stands with the people of New York. U.S. officials, meanwhile, tell CNN they have reason to believe that would-be terrorists still are in this country and may attempt to carry out further attacks. They say the terrorists they're speaking of may include more pilots. Today, the Justice Department released the names of 19 hijackers who struck on Tuesday. 7 were pilots. Around the United States today, Americans paused to remember the victims of Tuesday's attacks. And President Bush said the country will meet its responsibility to history. He's authorized the call-up of 50,000 reservists and has declared a state of national emergency. Bill Press and Tucker Carlson are standing by of our Crossfire team for more. Bill and Tucker?
Thanks, Wolf. It's been a day of mourning. The question, what next? How does America respond? Our conversations tonight with Larry Johnson, who's a former State Department counterterrorism official, and Jerry Bremer, who's the former chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. Bill Press.
Mr. Bremer, as Americans, all of us feel somehow we've been victims or wounded by these attacks, even though not directly. But for you, there was a very direct personal toll. Your company, Marsh McLennan, located in the South Tower of the World Trade Center. How badly were you hurt, and what is your company? How are you dealing with this?
We don't have final numbers yet, but we've obviously lost several hundreds of employees in this attack.
Your office was located in the South Tower. Where?
Most of the people who were missing were in the South Tower, the high floors above, really at the place and above where the second aircraft hit.
And how many did you have working there? Employees?
Well, we had a total of about 1,700 employees in the two buildings.
Of which, how many are accounted for now?
We can account for all but about 450.
450 missing among that total that Wolf gave us a little earlier. A lot of us, the question that I hear from people that I talk to is, and I'm sure it's some of your employees too, how do we know it's over? I mean, the people who are in those planes are dead, but we haven't found the person who coordinated the attacks yet. There's been not one arrest yet of any other suspects. We know there must be other people in this country. Isn't it pretty clear that they are here and that they could very well strike again and that it's not over?
Well, I think it isn't over even, I mean, I would say it wouldn't even be over if we had already arrested all the people who did this, because we are, you know, people talk about this being another Pearl Harbor, and in a way it is in this sense. Pearl Harbor was the first battle of a long war, and this is the first battle of a long war, and like as in Pearl Harbor, we lost this battle. In fact, this is going to turn out to be worse than Pearl Harbor. But as in the last war, we're going to win in the end. But it's going to be a long campaign, as Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz said yesterday. This is not a one-time thing. We're not going to talk about retaliation. Retaliation implies a tit for tat. We're talking about a war, and that's a campaign. And in a campaign, there are going to be a lot of battles. We're going to win some of these battles. We're going to lose some of these battles. There are going to be more civilian casualties on both sides. More Americans will die. Maybe there are more of these guys in the U.S. now. I certainly hope we catch them if they are. But I think now, my sense, talking to people just as I move around in Washington and New York, is that the American people are ready to understand and to be led by the President in what is going to be a very difficult task.
Larry Johnson, let's talk about the long war that Mr. Bremer is referring to. There appears to be a consensus, A, that nabbing a few terrorist leaders won't do it, and B, that a ground war in Afghanistan is not likely to be fruitful. The implication is that the United States will move against a country. What country do you think that's likely to be?
The swamp where the mosquitoes in this case reside is Afghanistan. They're not only housing Osama bin Laden, the Egyptian, two of the most radical Egyptian groups, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Al-Gama Islamiyah, the Saudi Hezbollah has a presence there as well. So most of the groups that have been targeting and killing Americans are hiding out and receiving safe haven in Afghanistan. They've been training. Last year, 60% of the people who died in international terrorist attacks died in India. The people carrying out those attacks came from camps in Afghanistan that were passing through Pakistan. Pakistan's also on the list. And it's a bit of a conundrum because on the one hand, they've been our very best friend in helping turn over terrorists such as Ramzi Youssef, the bomber of the World Trade Center, Meryl Malkanzi, the fellow who assassinated CIA employees. That said, they've been supporting the Taliban, and they've got to make a very difficult choice. They've got to either be on our side or the wrong side.
But let's get Afghanistan specifically.
Sure.
Parts of it famously inaccessible, famously difficult to have any effect by air. Of course, we failed to kill Osama bin Laden a couple of years ago from the air.
Sure.
So what does that mean exactly for American forces? Does it mean sending ground troops into Afghanistan?
Well, I think the Bush administration is moving in the right fashion. Number one, we do not want to get in a situation where it's the United States against a Muslim country alone. That's point one. They're moving to build a coalition, and when the body count is done up at the World Trade Center, it's U.S., it's Europeans, it's Latin Americans, it's Asian, and it will also be Middle Easterners whose bodies lie in that rubble. And therefore, that's why this is an attack against the world. And so there you can ratchet it up to diplomatic pressure, but ultimately when we go into a military, one of the hesitations in the past, you have to have forward staging bases. Until we get Pakistan on board, that's difficult. But now with the Russians coming in, you're looking at countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan who are on the north border of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has got a real serious problem down the road.
I want to follow up there, Mr. Bremer, with Osama bin Laden. The Washington Post reports that the CIA has had basically a blank check to go after Osama bin Laden and either capture him or eliminate him since 1998. He has eluded us, the most powerful nation on earth. He's eluded us for the last 3 years. What makes us think that we could get him now?
You know, I think when we talk about the next steps, it's a lot more complicated than Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. Basically, we need a three-ringed strategy. The inner ring of that strategy is to find out who did this, and it looks like it was bin Laden, and punish him, basically eliminate him if we can, and any state which provided him support, which means in this case Afghanistan. And in my view, I differ from Larry. I think it is going to mean putting an expeditionary force into Afghanistan with all that entails. The next ring out is to deal with all of the other terrorist groups, both bin Laden's and others that are around the circle. There are a lot of states which support terrorism, and we've looked the other way for the last 8 years. Syria, for example, Lebanon, Pakistan, as Larry points out. We're going to have to get the international community to take seriously that, and that's the third ring. The third ring is to get a new international consensus that says terrorism is simply no longer acceptable. Mm-hmm. We had a pretty good international consensus during the 80s under American leadership. We've lost it a bit now in the 90s because of a feckless counter-terrorist policy during the Clinton administration, and we're going to have to get it back. These three rings all have to operate together. It's a very difficult strategy, and the inner ring, as you said, Tucker, is militarily very difficult. I lived in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I know the people of Afghanistan, and I know the terrain, and they're both very tough. And there's already snow falling in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Going into Afghanistan has been, you know, the death of many expeditionary forces. So it's not an easy operation.
We can ask the Russians. But let me suggest that there may be a fourth ring, which is the American people. And right now they stand very strong, they stand very united. But I want to show you maybe a little contradiction. In our latest CNN poll asking American people what they would support, the first question, would you support strategic airstrikes against military targets? 85%, right, are there. Oppose only 11%. But you make that question, would you support massive bombings that might kill civilians? 48% favor, 46% oppose. We want to do it from the air, without any loss, without any American casualties.
Let me say this. This is basically the challenge of presidential leadership. The president's father faced the same kinds of polls before the Gulf War, and he turned it around entirely through an act of great presidential leadership in the fall of 1990. And this president now faces the similar challenge. He's got certainly a base of support, as you point out. Basically, it's not the fourth ring. It's the base on which all three rings are built. And he's got that base now, as you could see in the video clips of the reaction of the people down at the World Trade Center today. And now he's got the challenge as president to lead that forward, to do what is going to be done. It's going to be tough. We should not be kidding ourselves. There are going to be a lot more casualties.
Now, Mr. Johnson, nothing is scarier to most people than the idea of dying in a plane crash.
Sure.
What can we do to make air travel safer?
We need to do what we should have done 10 years ago, and there are four basic, very simple steps. Number one, we need to eliminate the double standards that we have for aviation security. There's one set in place for international, another set in place domestic, and in fact, even domestically, you have one level for some airports and a different level. Stop the nonsense, because that's predicated on being able to predict what someone's going to do. We can't do that. Build one system, high security, that's the standard. Second, professionalize and federalize the folks that man the security checkpoints at the airports. Even though in this case the breakdown was not there, nonetheless we need to make sure that that's a professional position, because there's entirely too much turnover and too many unsophisticated people. Third, we need to have all the equipment that's available technologically from detecting weapons and detecting explosives at those airports, at all airports, not just some airports, at all airports. Because right now, what we do in some parts of the country, we assume that nobody's going to get on board a plane with a bomb, because people won't do that. Well, that assumption no longer holds. And the last thing we need to do is onboard the aircraft itself. We need to get rid of this concept of, I call it the bandit and the teller. Right now, if you go to hijack an airplane, the procedure is for the crew to take you to the front and you get into the cockpit with the pilot. We can no longer afford to do that. We need now, from this point forward, put a new door on there that cannot be breached for about 5 minutes. In that 5-minute period, the pilots can do three things. They can descend to a lower altitude. They can alert appropriate officials, and they can also open a lockbox which contains a firearm, and whoever comes through the door gets shot and killed.
I'm just struck that all the suggestions that you've just laid out, none of them have taken effect yet. In fact, the things that we've seen, eliminating electronic tickets, curbside baggage check-in, closing National Airport possibly for good, all strike me as ways to punish air travelers, but they don't. It's not clear how they're going to make air travel safer.
The FAA is in a tough position. They've got to demonstrate that they're doing something, but the reality is most of what they're doing is cosmetic gesture.
Yeah. Jerry, just following up on that, Larry mentioned the distinction between maybe different kind of airports and foreign travel and domestic travel. But domestic travel, I haven't heard anybody talk about executive jets. I mean, isn't that one great big hole in the whole network?
Well, there were a lot of failures.
There's no screening at these executive jet airports.
That's right. There's basically none. No, that's right. I mean, I fly on executive jets from time to time, and there's no screening. Correct.
I would just want to add that to your list, that's all. But I want to ask you about intelligence, because you were chair of the National Commission on Terrorism. Here's a report that you released last June, actually.
A year ago, June.
A year ago, June 2000. I just want to read one sentence from your executive summary here. Today's terrorists seek to inflict mass casualties, and they are attempting to do so both overseas and on American soil. You point out there's a real problem with American intelligence. You make some 20 or more recommendations about changes that have to be made. It's been over a year and a half. How many of your recommendations have been adopted?
None that I'm aware of.
Why? Why not?
Well, in a way, you have to ask the administrations, both of them, Clinton, to whom we presented this report, and Bush, who's been in office since June, and Congress, because several of our recommendations were made to Congress. There was some effort last October in Congress to try to get some bills through to put some of these recommendations in. It got tied up with the election, and then, of course, they came back in special session, and the election sort of overwhelmed everything. It's... in a way, it's sort of personally heartbreaking for me. I don't argue that if they'd done these things, this wouldn't have happened. I think that's not the case. But As we pointed out in this report, there was a sort of risk-adverse culture that had been created, particularly in the intelligence community, and we focused on the CIA, but I think that's also been true in the FBI. And we certainly have seen some problems with the FBI ability to track terrorists in the United States out of this thing. Everything has to come back up on the table now. We need a whole new approach to counterterrorism. It's not just that we need this new approach that I describe internationally. We need a new approach in how we're going to organize the federal government to deal with this problem.
Right. Now, Larry Johnson, if it is true, and I suppose it is possible that there are terrorist cells still left in the United States, not yet apprehended, then that obviously raises the specter of more attacks. What can the average person do to protect himself? Anything?
One of the things we need to avoid, I mean, it's a natural reaction that people have had since the horror of Tuesday. The fear rises. But we need to reassure people that within the United States, we have a very effective law enforcement community. And one of the other things we're seeing in New York, a testimony to the prior preparation for the possibility of terrorism, that even though the New York City Police Department and Fire Department have lost almost 300 people, they've still been able to respond and continue operating, and they even lost their operations center. I think we need to understand that at the core of the government, while there's this perception that sometimes it doesn't work right, and it doesn't, there is a genuine commitment to try to prevent this. And it is what Osama bin Laden did the other day, is he has awakened not just the United States, but he has awakened the world into a battle that he's not prepared for, because there is no terrorist in the world that can continue to operate internationally unless they have a place and base of support. This wouldn't have been possible in the United States if Afghanistan had turned him over after the East Africa bombing trials in New York earlier this year.
Right. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Jerry Bremer, good to have you here. Larry Johnson, nice to have you back in Crossfire. That's all from Bill and Tucker. We'll go back now to CNN's Wolf Blitzer. Wolf?
Thank you very much, Bill and Tucker. We have a developing story that our Justice Department producer, Terry Frieden, is telling us about. We are now reporting that one arrest warrant has been issued by the Justice Department, an arrest warrant for what is described as a material witness in this continuing investigation. This is the first formal arrest warrant that we've learned about in the investigation since it began, obviously, Tuesday morning. Just repeating, the Justice Department tonight issuing an arrest warrant for a material witness. We don't know the name of this witness or where this witness might be located. It's obviously a developing story. We will continue to monitor it and provide additional details as they become available. Joey?
Well, if we have talked, at least in this half hour, about so many things, about the politics and the choices that would have to be made, now as well talking about the investigation. Let us not lose sight, however, of what was lost in these tragedies, and that is life. So many young lives are lost. So much of the hope of the future ahead was lost in these many tragedies. How much hope went aloft on Flight 175? That is the flight from Boston to Los Angeles. More from CNN's Frank Sesno.
Lost on United Flight 175 from Boston, headed to Los Angeles. Ace Bailey, a Stanley Cup champion, the director of pro scouting for the LA Kings. It would have been his 32nd season working in the NHL. Mark Bavis was flying with him, a young King scout who played hockey for Boston University, where his twin brother is now assistant coach. Lisa Frost was a star student, graduating first in her class from Boston University this year. She was headed to see her parents, Tom and Melanie, and getting ready to start a new job next week in San Francisco. Sean Nasani and his girlfriend, Lynn Goodchild, took off for a vacation in Hawaii. They were active and athletic. He, especially, loved to run and ski. Ronald Gamboa managed a Gap store in Santa Monica. He and his longtime partner, Daniel Brandhorst, were headed back to California. With them, the son they had adopted together, David Brandhorst. United Airlines 175 crashed into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001 at 9:03 a.m. Eastern Time.
Let us not forget all those many lives that were lost, Wolf. In fact, we'll probably not ever hear all the stories of all those individuals involved, but you cannot help but be moved when you realize how much was cut short in these tragedies.
each and every one so tragic and so sad. Multiply that by the thousands, and I don't think any of us will ever appreciate how awful this situation is. And of course, around the country over these past several minutes, over the past hour, there have been these candlelight vigils that have been continuing. We want to take a look at some of them here in Virginia, nearby Arlington, Virginia. A group has gathered with flags in an outburst of not only prayer and reflection, but also patriotism around the country as Americans of every origin and ethnic tie and religion, they gather, they meet, they share words. This is a moment where the American people clearly want to be together, to think about what has happened. From Virginia, we go to New York City. Look at this. The flag, the American flag, every place you look, people gathering with candles, remembering, trying to understand what has happened, although I don't think any of us could ever really appreciate, fully understand, fully grasp this horrible, horrible situation. This is outside the Armory in New York City, where so many of the loved ones are missing. Now we go to Providence, Rhode Island, where there's a huge candlelight gathering in Providence, not far away from Boston, from Logan Airport, in fact, where two of those doomed airliners took off early Tuesday morning.
Make sure you don't block their view and try to split.
And now to Somerset, Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, near the crash of one of those doomed airliners that was making some very, very exotic turns, apparently heading back towards Washington from Pennsylvania as it crashed near Somerset, Pennsylvania. It's about 70 miles from Pittsburgh. And now ground zero in Manhattan, where the search and rescue operation continues. Tons and tons, tens of thousands of tons of rubble, the debris being cleared as people begin to try to get over this crisis. But around the country, just as here in Washington, where the nation's leaders gathered at the National Cathedral for some prayer and reflection earlier today, it was a similar scene around the country, as our own Bruce Morton reports.
Church services everywhere. America's leadership was at Washington's National Cathedral, but services everywhere. Cleveland, Ohio.
We mourn for the many lives lost in a tragedy that remains etched in our minds forever.
Boston, Massachusetts.
Look with compassion on the whole human family, and especially on those who lost their lives this week.
Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer.
At the Pentagon, where many lost fellow workers and friends.
May God comfort all of you that are in loss today, and may we wait on Him and renew our strength.
Manchester, New Hampshire. An Islamic service in Sterling, Virginia, near Dulles Airport.
When people accuse you of being terrorists, this is because this is what they were told.
Austin, Texas.
Banish the violence that has been in our midst and the evil that exists around us.
Back at Washington's National Cathedral, the Commander-in-Chief.
This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
That service ended with a hymn, a battle hymn. Bruce Morton, CNN, Washington.
And I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting tonight from Washington. I'll be back with Greta Van Susteren at the top of the hour, but for now, back to Joey in Atlanta. Joey?
Well, to our viewers, I'm Joey Chen. We appreciate your being with us this hour, and throughout this day here on CNN, we have remembered, we have honored with the nation all of the sadness, all the tragedy, and all the loss for so many people in this country on this particular day. This has been a day of national remembrance, of national prayer, of the horrible loss that the nation has suffered on this day, and a memory of Tuesday, when in New York, everything changed in just 1 minute.
Never really know what's going on. Look at me sometimes like all you want to do is run. Hear me out, hear me out. It's all the things you never show. There are the things I want to know. Secrets start in your heart so slow. But if you don't want to tell me now, I guess I'll never know. Losing almost all my energy. It's getting hard to talk to you, and I'm the only one who speaks. It's all the things you never show. There are the things I want to know. Secrets start in your heart so slow. But if you don't want to tell me now, I guess I'll never know. Here we go, turning all the wrongs into rights. Here we go, you can take me there tonight. Whoa, this life is all we know. Whoa, I can't stay if you can't let it go. I never really know what's going on. And even when you're next to me, I feel like you were gone. It's all the things you never.
Before we leave you this hour, I want to show some more pictures of what's going on, this candlelight vigil here first in New York City outside the Armory, where thousands of people have been searching for loved ones still missing from the rubble, missing from the destruction of the World Trade Center's twin complex Tuesday morning. From New York, we're going to show you other live pictures of these vigils that have been going on around the United States. This still in Manhattan, outside the Armory. Now we go to Somerset, Pennsylvania, near the crash of that other airliner that was doomed Tuesday morning, hijacked, crashed. People in western Pennsylvania reflecting, like people all over the United States right now, gathering with their candles, with their American flags, trying to remember, trying to understand, if they can. And now nearby Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. in northern Virginia, across the Potomac River, from Washington, from the nation's capital, right next to the Pentagon, where there was another crash Tuesday morning into one of the corridors of the Pentagon with destructive power. These candles are also in Houston, Texas, where people are gathering an hour earlier, of course, in Houston than on the East Coast of the United States. This is in the Central Time Zone. People are trying to understand, of course, what happened, but they're also displaying their unity. And so far, we're not seeing a tremendous outpouring of anger, but we're seeing an enormous amount of compassion and understanding of what happened. Once again, candlelight ceremonies all around the United States at this hour. CNN's continuing coverage is going to continue right now with a CNN special report.
Tonight, a CNN special report, America's New War, Response and Remembrance.